Okay, John, USDA report comes out yesterday, throws the market for a real spin. Overreaction?
I think it was to a certain extent, Sean, and it was yesterday's report. Obviously, saw a huge sell-off in most of the markets, particularly the corn and the wheat. And I think it was a report. Like certainly, it was not a friendly report. We had probably could be described as a little bit negative numbers, but almost across the board. And so it's not surprised that there would be some negative reaction to that, but where we probably maybe got a little overdone to the downside is that we had a lot of outside money that got flushed out, and we kind of had this negative report that coincided on the same day as we had a $5 drop in crude oil. We had a sell-off in gold, stock markets, a lot of other financial markets, and so it just I would say maybe added to the intensity of what would have been maybe a bit of a softer market anyway. And so I think from the perspective of sort of the commercials, they would probably look at it and say, yeah, a little bit of a negative report, but nothing that was maybe a game changer from that perspective. But it was kind of the outside and the spec money that maybe took a bit of a negative report, took a lot of outside markets that were getting hammered, and really came after the grain markets and sold it hard.
Where I guess we're experiencing maybe one of the realities of having so much hedge fund money involved in the commodity markets. It's fun on the way up. When we get some bad news compounded with some more bad news, we definitely feel the volatility to the downside.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, sometimes the funds can be your best friend, and sometimes they're your worst enemy. And certainly they've been carrying pretty big long positions, but it's hot money, and it can be fickle money. And the reality is that the grain markets are relatively small markets compared to something like crude oil or some of the other financial markets. And so if they sell off these markets and maybe maybe for reasons that aren't at times fundamentally justified seemingly on the surface, but because they're relatively small markets and the amounts of money are so huge, the impact on grain prices can be disproportionately large if everybody's wanting to get out at the same time.
Well, so where do we sit right now? It's been interesting. I think everybody was quite bullish up until May, and that's kind of when I've always sort of noticed where thoughts kind of change depending on which analyst you talk to. What's your position as of, we're in May? What's your position going forward through the summer now?
Well, I mean, we are in the weather market, and weather markets are just volatile and they're unpredictable, and that's just how it is. I think from our perspective, we're fairly aggressively sold for most of our clients on old crop. We've got some new crop sales in the books, and that's a position we're fairly comfortable with. I think May and into early June is a critical time for a lot of crops, and not just here in North America, but also in Europe and the Black Sea region and some of those areas. And so I guess in terms of where we go from here, I mean, a lot hinges on what kind of weather we're going to get in some pretty critical growing areas. And so people are watching dry conditions in Europe, seeing what the outcome of this Black Sea crop will be. Obviously, we got planting delays here on the prairies and through the northern U.S. All those things are going to have a huge impact going forward here. So but kind of within all of this, as we've seen in the last day or two, is also what these outside markets are going to do, and that's going to shape us as well. So it is an important month in terms of how things will shape up going forward, and a lot of it does hinge on weather. We do have S&Ds that are fairly tight, even though yesterday's USDA report was a little on the bearish side. It still shows a fairly tight S&D for corn and soybeans, and a lot of our prairie crops are in a similar boat. If we pull off a big crop and the weather works out, and we turn things around and have some better weather in Europe and some of these places, yeah, certainly we add a little more cushion in these markets, and that's not friendly to prices going forward. But markets are tight enough that if we do continue to have some weather problems in some of these key areas, it could be pretty positive prices, perhaps irrespective to a certain extent of what goes on in the broader macro markets. So it's kind of a critical window.
Yeah, we knew Western Canada was going to be fairly wet. Maybe what we didn't see coming as much was for a lot of our Ontario viewers, they've definitely had some struggles getting started planting corn. You mentioned the U.S. There's been some struggles kind of getting going there. I've been seeing a lot of activity on Twitter talking about guys waiting to get started. What do you think about what kind of effect is that going to have on the corn market?
Yeah, I think the corn market is kind of the one that seems to drive all these other markets in a lot of ways. And I think if we want to sit there and peel apart that USDA report a little bit yesterday in terms of corn, I mean, I think people are questioning. They basically used the acres that were as part of the March planting intentions report, and kind of from the outset, people are wondering if there's too many acres there in terms of by the time you combine the corn and the soybeans and the wheat and some of these other crops. And then the other part of it is even if all those acres did get in, which is of course a question mark. I mean, we know how far behind North Dakota, Minnesota are, Ohio, some of these other states. There's a lot of flooding along the Mississippi River, so I think at a minimum you got to look at seeing some acres lost there. And then what's the impact going to be on yield as this crop gets in a little late, and what kind of where is it going to be in the growing cycle when the heat of summer steps in? I think those are all question marks here going forward, and so certainly there's some risks on the production side.
Yeah.
Who knows? Obviously, there's a lot of weather ahead of us, and it might pan out, and we might pull off a big yield and add that little extra cushion and take some of the urgency out of the market. But it also wouldn't take much to tighten this thing up, and there's not a lot of room in that S&D to handle any kind of a meaningful production setback. So I think that's why this market is so sensitive to planting conditions everywhere.
When we look at that tight S&D, isn't that really the fundamental indication that possibly we got some more upside to some of these markets because the S&D is so tight?
Yeah, certainly that's possible. Now, I think one thing we also have to remember is that prices are also very high. So fundamentals are bullish or bearish relative to where prices are at. And when you're talking, $7 corn, that's a high price for corn. So to a certain extent, that's accounted for that. We have seen some demand rationing at these price levels as well. So that is one of the ways that the market is trying to work its way through that is rationing out some demand at these high prices. But it is a reminder that we see some of these pullbacks. There seems to be some buying on these market pullbacks. And a certain amount of this demand is going to be very difficult to ration out at a certain point. Ethanol mandates. There's always going to be a certain amount of livestock feeding. You can only substitute in so and so much. It is a tight S&D, and there just is not a lot of room for production setbacks. So again, prices are high. If the weather pans out okay, and this looks like it's more of a scare than a longer-term imminent threat, we could see some downside. But it's a weather market, and prices are gonna reflect whatever the latest forecast is.
When's the next key USDA report for viewers to follow?
Well, they come out every month with their latest changes to their S&Ds, and I think for the old crop, I mean, we're far enough along in the crop here that we're probably not going to see huge changes in that here going forward. So I think probably over the next month or two, it's going to be more about the weather and where the trade is maybe sort of handicapping where those acres and yields will be rather than the official USDA numbers per se. So, it's going to be over the next few weeks here, certainly about the forecast, about planting pace, and what kind of shape that crop's going to be in coming out.
Okay, cool. Okay, John, thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you again soon.
All right, my pleasure, Sean. Anytime.